the last days of it, my father got this idea because Khrushchev had sent 2 letters. He sent one letter that was conciliatory, and then he sent a letter that after his Joint Chiefs and the warmongers around him saw that letter and they disapproved of it, they sent another letter that was extremely belligerent. And my father had the idea, let's just pretend we didn't get the second letter and reply to the first one. And then he went down to Dobrynin, and he met Dobrynin in the Justice Department. And Dobrynin was the Soviet ambassador, and they proposed this settlement, which was a secret settlement where Khrushchev would withdraw the missiles from Cuba. Khrushchev had put the missiles in Cuba because we had put missiles, nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy. And my uncle's secret deal was that if Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba, within 6 months, he would get rid of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. But if Khrushchev told anybody about the deal, it was off. So if news got out about that secret deal, it was off. But that was the actual deal. And Khrushchev complied with it, and then my uncle complied with it.
How much of that part of human history turned on the decisions of one person?
I think that's one of the, because that, of course, is the perennial question, right? But is history kind of on an automatic pilot, and human decisions, the decisions of leaders, really only have a marginal or incremental bearing on what is going to happen anyway. But I think that is and historians argue about that all the time. I think that is a really good example of a place in human history that literally the world could have ended if we had a different leader in the White House. And the reason for that is that there were, as I recall, 64 gun emplacements, missile emplacements. Each one of those missile emplacements had a crew of about 100 men, and they were Soviets. So we didn't know whether we had a couple of questions that my uncle asked asked the CIA, and he asked, Dulles was already gone, but he asked the CIA and he asked his military brass, because they all wanted to go in. Everybody wanted to go in, and my uncle asked to see the aerial photos, and he examined those personally. And this is why it's important to have a leader in the White House who can push back on their bureaucracies. And then he asked them, who's manning those missile sites? And are they Russians? And if they're Russians and we bomb them, isn't it going to force Khrushchev to then go into Berlin? And that would be the beginning of a cascade effect that would, highly likely to end in nuclear confrontation. And the military brass said to my uncle, "Oh, we don't think he'll have the guts to do that." Mm-hmm. So my uncle was like, "That's what you're betting on?" And they all wanted him to go in. They wanted him to bomb the sites and then invade Cuba. Mm-hmm. And he said, if we bomb those sites, we're going to be killing Russians. And it's going to provoke Russia into some response. And the obvious response is for them to go into Berlin. But the thing that we didn't know then, that we didn't find out until I think, there was like a 30-year anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis in Havana. And what we learned then was that from the Russians who came to that event, it was like a symposium where everybody on both sides talked about it, and we learned a lot of stuff that nobody knew before. One of the most insane thing that we learned was that the weapons were already, the nuclear warheads were already in place. They were ready to fire, and that the authorization to fire was delegated to each of the gun crew commanders. So there were 60 people who had all had authorization to fire if they felt themselves under attack. So you have to believe that at least one of them would have launched, and that would have been the beginning of the end. And, if anybody had launched, we knew what would happen. My uncle knew what would happen because he asked again and again, what's going to happen? And they said, 30 million Americans will be killed, but we will kill 130 million Russians. So we will win. And that was a victory for them. And my uncle later said, he told Arthur Schlesinger and Kenny O'Donnell, he said, those guys, he called them the salad brass, the guys with all of this stuff on their chests. And he said, those guys, they don't care because they know that if it happens, that they're going to be in the charge of everything. They're the ones who are going to be running the world after that. Mm-hmm. So for them, there was an incentive to kill 130 million Russians and 30 million Americans. But my uncle, he had this correspondence with Khrushchev. They were secretly corresponding with each other. And that is what saved the world, is that both of them had been men of war. Eisenhower famously said, it will not be a man of war. It will not be a soldier who starts World War III, because a guy who's actually seen it knows how bad it is. And my uncle, had been in the heat of the South Pacific. His boat had been cut in two by a Japanese destroyer. Three of his crewmen had been killed. One of them badly burned. He pulled that guy with a lanyard in his teeth 6 miles to an island in the middle of the night, and then they hid out there for 10 days, and he came back. Like I said, he was the only president of the United States that earned the Purple Heart. Meanwhile, Khrushchev had been at Stalingrad, which was the worst place to be on the planet, probably in the 20th century, other than, in Auschwitz or one of the death camps. It was, it was the most ferocious, horrific war with people starving, people, committing cannibalism, eating the dogs, the cats, eating their shoe leather, freezing to death by the thousands, etc. Khrushchev did not want. The last thing he wanted was a war, and the last thing my uncle wanted was a war. But the CIA did not know anything about Khrushchev, and the reason for that is there was a mole at Langley, so that every time the CIA got a spy in the Kremlin, he would immediately be killed. So they had no eyes in the Kremlin. There were literally hundreds of Russian spies who had defected the United States and were in the Kremlin who were killed during that period. They had no idea anything about Khrushchev, about how he saw the world, and they saw the Kremlin itself as a monolith, that this kind of, the same way that we look at Putin today, that, it's all, they have this ambition of world conquest, and it's driving them, and there's nothing else they think about. They're absolutely single-minded about it. But actually, there was a big division between Khrushchev and his joint chiefs and his intelligence apparatus, and they both at one point discovered they were both in the same situation. They were surrounded by spies and military personnel who were intent on going to war, and they were the two guys resisting it. So when my uncle had this idea of, being the peace president from the beginning, he told Ben Bradley, one of his best friends, who, was the publisher of the Washington Post, or the editor-in-chief at that time, he said, Ben Bradley asked him, what do you want on your gravestone? And my uncle said, he kept the peace. He said, the principal job of the president of the United States is to keep the country out of war. And so when he first became president, he anxiously agreed to meet Khrushchev in Geneva to do a summit. And by the way, Eisenhower had wanted to do the same thing. Eisenhower wanted peace, but he was going to meet in Vienna. But that peace summit was blown up. He was going to try to do, he was going to try to end the Cold War. Eisenhower was in the last year of his in May of 1960. But that was torpedoed by the CIA during the U-2 crash. They sent a U-2 over the Soviet Union. It got shot down, and then Allen Dulles told Eisenhower to deny that we had a program. They didn't know that the Russians had captured Gary Francis Powers. And so and that blew up the peace talks between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. And so, there was a lot of tension. My uncle wanted to break that tension. He agreed to meet with Khrushchev in Vienna early on in his term. He went over there, and Khrushchev snubbed him. Khrushchev lectured him imperiously about the terror of American imperialism and rebuffed any. They did agree not to go into Laos. They made an agreement that kept the United States, kept my uncle from sending troops to Laos. But it had been a disaster, Vienna. So then we had a spy that used to come to our house all the time, a guy called Georgy Bolshoi. He was this Russian spy my parents had met at the embassy. They had gone to a party or a reception at the Russian embassy, and he had approached them, and they knew he was a GRU agent and KGB. He was both. Oh, he used to come to our house. They really liked him. He was very attractive. He was always laughing and joking. He would do rope climbing contests with my father. He would do push-up contests with my father. He could do the Russian dancing, the Cossack dancing. And he would do that for us and teach us that. And we knew he was a spy too. And this was at the time of, the James Bond films were first coming out. So it was really exciting for us to have an actual Russian spy in our house. The State Department was horrified by it. Yeah. But anyway, when Khrushchev, after Vienna and after, the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev had second thoughts. And he sent this long letter to my uncle. And he didn't want to go through his State Department or his embassy. He wanted to end run them. And he was friends with Bolshoi. So he gave Georgie the letter. And Georgie brought it and handed it to Pierre Salinger, folded in the New York Times. And he gave it to my uncle. And it was this beautiful letter, which he said, my uncle had talked to him about the children who were played. We played 29 grandchildren who were playing in his yard. And he's saying, what is our moral basis for making a decision that could kill these children so they'll never write a poem, they'll never participate in an election, they'll never run for office? How can we morally make a decision that is going to eliminate life for these beautiful kids? And he had said that to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev wrote them this letter back saying that he was now sitting as his dacha on the Black Sea, and that he was thinking about what my Uncle Jack had said to him at Vienna, and he regretted very deeply not having taken the olive leaf that Jack had offered him. And then he said, it occurs to me now that we're all on an ark, and that there is not another one, and that the entire fate of the planet and all of its creatures and all of the children are dependent on the decisions we make. And you and I have a moral obligation to go forward with each other as friends. And immediately after that, this was, he sent that right after the Berlin crisis in 1962. General Curtis LeMay had tried to provoke a war with an incident at Checkpoint Charlie, which was the entrance and exit through the Berlin Wall in Berlin. And the Russian tanks had come to the wall, the U.S. tanks had come to the wall, and there was a standoff. And my uncle had sent a message to Khrushchev then through Dobrynin saying, my back is at the wall. I have no place to please back off. And then we will back off. And Khrushchev took his word, backed his tanks off first, and then my uncle ordered LeMay to back. LeMay had mounted bulldozer plows on the front of the tanks to plow down the Berlin Wall, mm-hmm. and the Russians had come. So it was just his generals trying to provoke a war, and but they started talking to each other, and then after he wrote that letter, they agreed that they would install a hotline. so they could talk to each other and they wouldn't have to go through intermediaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so at Jack's house on the Cape, there was a red phone that we knew if we picked it up, Khrushchev would answer.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another one in the White House.
Yeah.
But they knew it was important to talk to each other, and you just wish that we had that kind of leadership today.